have other people who are coming in to present their different
Jim was
concerns?
going to attend.
Do you know when he's coming?
I got in touch with all four,
Yeah,
and Jim and Joel are two available.
okay. And do you know if Jim coming?
He said he'd be here.
At the beginning, he didn't like not a half hour into it or anything
No.
like that, okay.
Jim Doss still, I know he was interested at one point in time, but,
I haven't heard.
yeah.
No, he isn't.
Yeah. And just, ground rules on our part, we have the room reserved till 6:30, I don't know.
Well, that's good, I gotta leave here by 6:25 anyway.
Okay.
I'm gonna be
That's
home
good.
by 6:30.
Okay, we'll try to make it 6:20 so you don't break any
Excellent.
rules.
So to provide a little context for our guests, why don't we kind of explain who we are and what our mission has been given to us.
Are we sure of our mission?
Yeah, well, I choose my words carefully. This is called the Working Group on the Zoning, we're calling us the Zoning Revisions Committee, as I think influence of one of your suggestions, as opposed to the
It was originally called the Rezoning Committee.
the Rezoning Committee, right? So
I think
and-
people off about what you were up to.
So, and this came out of a recommendation from the Sustainability report, and that there ought to be some type, welcome, we just started and we're doing a quick little overview of who we are and what we think we're doing. And so there was this recommendation from the Sustainability plan to have something they call the Rezoning Committee. And about a couple of months ago, there was a joint meeting of the planning board and the city council to begin discussing this. And a draft proposal was presented, and it raised concerns from some and questions from a lot of other folks. And so we had a very involved discussion for over an hour. It might have been, I can't remember how long that discussion went on for, but it was a lengthy discussion. And a number of different points and a number of different concerns were raised. And it ended, as many large meetings do, with a recommendation that there be a smaller group meet and to come back with a proposal. So that smaller group is us. We're the working groups. It has 2 city councilors and 2 members of the planning board. And this is our second meeting, I believe, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we went over and had a general discussion at our first meeting in this room. It was kind of brief. And then one of the things that we decided is to invite people who had expressed interest in it and with some of their ideas. And I think both of these gentlemen had emailed us, and some other folks had called one or more of us up or emailed us as well. So we thought, okay, let's have some public input from people who have expressed some interest and have expressed some ideas. So we're in a kind of an information gathering point now, and at some point in time, we will be probably making a draft proposal, which will go back to, I presume, a combined meeting of the city council and the planning board, and that will be a posted public meeting. And then they'll respond to what our draft is. So just to give you a, yes.
Am I allowed to ask a question?
Sure.
How did this configuration of people, other than Joel and this gentleman?
The 4 of us?
Yeah, how
We
did
were
you?
the 4 dummies who volunteered.
I see, we volunteered.
They asked for volunteers, and this is what they got.
Well, it came from, did it, because it was a joint planning board city council meeting, so when they said, gee, we want a smaller group to look at it, they picked 2 councilors and 2 planning board members and said, you guys go and make a suggestion, come up with a suggestion and bring it back. So really, all we're supposed to do is make a suggestion. We don't decide, we just suggest.
No, I understand,
Yeah,
I'm
and
just thinking about your backgrounds
that's how
and
we-
how
There
you came
That's
to be
it.
on
was
this committee.
volunteers, and there weren't
Yeah.
many takers,
Yeah.
believe
We
me.
just didn't have enough committees to sit on.
Yeah, I did. can't keep the arm down sometimes. So, thanks for asking that, so that's where we are. And do we all know everybody in the room? So why don't we go around and do introductions. I'm Michael Bardsley, City Councilor at Large.
And I'm George Cohen, I'm from the planning board.
Ken Jodrey, I'm also from the planning board.
Jim Nash with the Ward 3 Neighborhood Association.
Oh, Jim.
Huh?
Adam
Jim.
Cohen from the North Street Neighborhood Association.
You're on.
Oh, I'm sorry, Marie Hershkowitz, Ward 3 resident.
Joel Russell, live on Kensington Avenue, and I've spent the last 25 years being a consultant to cities and towns on revising zonings.
And David Murphy, and I'm from the city council.
So why don't we start with Joe? Are you on a little bit of a time frame? Did you have another meeting after this?
No.
Okay. So unless there's, do you have a time frame?
I just want to be done by 7.
We all want to be done even before that. So what?
Before we start with Joel, just like, so at our first meeting, the four of us talked about some things. We have this rough, very rough shape in our mind of what things might look like, a couple of different options. At this point in time, we're kind of putting that to the side and we're opening it up for anything and everything that Joel wants to talk. This is more in a question form. Anything and everything that Jim and Joel want to talk about and suggest their recommendations for the committee? Do we want to lay out our kind of boilerplate structure of what we're thinking and let them respond to that? Or are we asking the public to say, what is your dream zoning revisions committee? Because I'm a little nervous that we may hear that there should be another planning board or something. I think
Okay.
we need to set some
You're
kind
nervous
of
we may be
parameters.
misinterpreted about what we're doing?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Maybe that's, maybe it should just be a blank slate, I don't know.
Well, has the, what we refer to as our kind of boilerplate ideas, have they been made public? Do these?
No,
Okay.
no.
So I have a suggestion.
Good job.
And that is, let us make our cases, and then where there's overlap, it looks like you're agreeing with us.
Uh-huh.
And then, and like, oh, that was a great idea, we concur with that. And then, then it doesn't, it puts you in the role of not looking like deciders.
Very good.
Okay.
Very good. The last thing in the world I want to be is a decider.
I know you could.
Okay.
What,
You want me to start?
yeah.
Okay. It's kind of a busman's holiday for me. I'm trying to, I need to step back from my normal role, which is kind of going in and advising the community about how to do this, because I've done it in dozens of communities, so, but I have a lot of experience as a result. Part of it comes down to what is the purpose of this committee? I mean, it seems to me that it's, first and foremost, it's to revise the Northampton zoning ordinance to bring it into conformity or to implement the sustainability plan. And my reading of the sustainability plan is that it had a couple of pages that were just jam-packed with zoning recommendations that probably very few people read and even fewer understood, would be my guess. And that needs to be substantially fleshed out for people to understand what this is all about. I'm kind of stepping out. My usual role is as the consultant to the professional, so I'm trying to put myself on the other side of the table, as in your position or as a citizen. And it seems to me that and I've worked with a lot of different committees, and the ones that I think have worked best have been relatively small. Sometimes they've been the planning board, where the planning board isn't that busy, in a smaller town, for example. Or they've had representation from the planning board, from the legislative body, the council. And they've drawn from citizens who have expertise, and the people selected have been selected with a view toward balance. Not necessarily representation of every interest, but people who understand how developers think, people who understand how citizen groups think, people who understand the different parts of the city. They don't have to all come from, you don't have to have somebody from each ward, as long as you have people who understand the issues of the different wards, so that they can function effectively as a committee. The other thing is that, unlike a comprehensive planner, which is not supposed to be a technical document, although ours turned out a little more technical than I would like, zoning is technical by its nature, you know, and so I think the people who are on this committee have to understand zoning. And some of, you know, those of you who are on the planning board have had to wrestle with it, more probably than other people in the city government. Sometimes people on the zoning board have, but we have a very talented community. I mean, there are a lot of people in this community who are professional planners, who are attorneys who deal with land use, who are architects who deal with land use, landscape architects. I mean, there's just a huge pool of talent, and I think that we could do a lot more with that pool than we do. And so I think it's important to have people who can understand what the document. And also, I mean, I'm not sure. What's happened over and over again in my experience is that you start out thinking you're just going to make a few changes to the zoning code to bring it in line with the sustainability plan, but you find out that every section is hooked to 5 or 6 other sections, and you change one section and all of a sudden it has implications for 5 or 6 other sections, and then you have to look at those sections, and then you look at those, and then suddenly you realize, oh, well, that is going to affect this other section. And it turns out that it's all hooked together. And so, although I understand in theory why you would want to say, oh, we're only going to look at the things that directly relate to sustainability, I think if you arbitrarily exclude looking at the rest of the code, it's not going to be as effective. And there are going to be things that need to be looked at, and it may lead to a more comprehensive look at the zoning code, which personally I think might be a good thing. I think there are some things about the way our zoning code is written that work, and some things about it that don't. So I would hope that the committee would be able to take that broader view and would be able to understand what it says, and would be able to understand what is being proposed, you know, and would be, I mean, one of the things that's not clear to me from what I've read in the paper is who's actually going to write it, you know, I mean, since I've always been the one that actually wrote it, I don't know how that, you know, how that's going to happen. So that's one question that I don't know the answer to it, but the other thing that I think is really important is how you involve the public. And I think zoning is not something that can be really written by group process or committee, large committee, or in a big public meeting. I think what you need a lot of public input at the beginning. When, for example, those 2 or 3 pages in the sustainability plan, which, you know, are really kind of, I think there are some recommendations that might be considered. There are probably a lot of other ways to implement the sustainability plan besides the things that are listed there. And I don't think it's written in a way that people understand. So I think there has to be upfront a process that's very inclusive, that involves a lot of people and kind of improves people's understanding of what it's all about, and kind of maybe floats some of the basic ideas that we're thinking about, but translates them into layman's terms so that people understand what we're talking about. Then you get input on that, and what will probably happen is you're going to get some questioning of the sustainability plan itself. You know, because once people realize, oh, when you put it in the zoning, it's going to mean this or it's going to mean that, you know, you may call into question, and then, you know, you have to. That's just how it works. But you know, and so you have an open process up front. Then you kind of have to close the doors for a while you work on it. You know, and not that you exclude people, but it's just you can't have a lot. I mean, they can be open meetings in the sense that anybody can come, but they're working sessions in which the goal is to hammer out a document or a draft document, and then you open it up again and you have public comment. And what I found is that you usually have to go through a couple of rounds of that. You know, you do a draft and you work it over, and then you send it out for public review, and then you get comments, and then you work it over again. Sometimes it can be split into like a fast track and a slow track. like, you pick out the 6 things that, if you could do these 6 things, it would really make the most difference, and they're relatively non-controversial. So, you know, you pick the 6 relatively easy things. Sometimes you're surprised the thing you think isn't gonna be controversial turns out. So you have to let it go and put it back onto the sort of second tier process. But, because I think, you know, you wanna see some results, and I've seen these processes drag on for way too long. So, I think it's important to structure it, and you can't really know till you get going, especially until after that first big public input session. What's going to be pretty straightforward and what's likely to be more controversial. And you know, just I'll put in a quick little plug for this Notre Dame thing that I've been advocating, because I think that its value is that it raises the level of understanding of a whole bunch of concepts that are in the sustainability plan and that people just don't understand from reading or from not reading the sustainability plan. And they'll have them in graphic representation, and they'll be able to say, oh, is that what you mean? Or, you know, we don't like that, or we do like that, or, you know, can you do it this way instead of that way? You know, I mean, for example, you know, 8 units to the acre can look horrible, and 8 units to the acre can look beautiful, depending on how it's designed. And if you just talk about, well, we're gonna do 8 units to the acre, you know, you're gonna scare people to death because they think it's too dense, and other people, you know, but you have to see how you do it, you know. So, and I think ideally that's part of the process. That's why I thought this was a good time to, rather than waiting till the zoning revision is underway and you get it sort of half done, then you bring in people to illustrate what might happen. Get those illustrations out in front of people first, then they can kind of see what they like, what they don't like. Then you translate that into zoning. So that's, I guess in a nutshell, that's kind of how I would approach it.
Can I ask a couple of questions?
Sure.
Just based on, you know,
Yeah.
on some things you said. So if not talking about the composition of the working group, but if the procedure was that the working group would make its recommendations.
You talking about this working group?
Well, no, we're gonna, our purpose is to
the zoning
recommend
revision committee.
how to have it, you know, how to compose a zoning revision committee. But you were talking more of process. If the zoning revision committee, however, we end up constituting it, or will recommend that the planning board and council will probably constitute it. If their work product, and just to follow the process, their recommendations would go to the planning board, that's the parent organization of this whole process, where the planning board would then do public hearings on it. And if there were to be zoning changes recommended, they would be recommended from the planning board to the city council, who makes the zoning changes. Then council would send it to ordinance that would have, so theoretically, the planning board would have public hearings on it.
That's our understanding,
Yeah.
but again, we've
Yeah.
opened up
Well,
that process.
But that's kind of why I wanted to walk
Yeah.
it through based on, you know,
Well,
it would go to planning board
Can I-
and it would go to council.
Well, can I comment on that? First of all, I think that the first couple rounds, certainly the first round of this should be informal.
Mhm.
It shouldn't, we don't, you know, and I think it's best if this, well, depending on how you constitute the committee, but the committee includes people from the planning board and the council on it. Then you don't have to have formal public hearings, you have some kind of workshop type format where you get a lot of, I find public hearings are generally the least constructive way to get useful input. That a workshop type format is usually more effective. And you have to have public hearings
Mhm.
legally before you can
Yeah.
adopt something, but you go through an informal process first. And then, you know, there are different ways to structure the critical path of approval. A number, I believe, but I know, yeah, I've researched this because I'm working on it with the city of Springfield right now. The most efficient way to do it is you can have the planning board and the ordinance committee hold a joint hearing. And that is the hearing. I mean, once you figure out what you want to do, and then it goes to council. You can also, I mean, if you want, you can have separate hearings. You can have a hearing with the planning board, a hearing with the ordinance committee, or a full hearing with city council. I think it's usually a good idea, just just to make sure everybody feels comfortable to have a full hearing with the city council, but.
So the zoning revision committee would be the more workshop format.
Right.
But
But the
I
purpose
just
of
wanna
the
think
zoning
this
revision
through.
committee is to generate a proposal,
Right.
and then that proposal gets walked through the planning board.
So
and
that's the
council.
more workshopy give and take
Right,
with
yeah.
the community, you know, at
That's
that
what I-
level.
Yeah,
So then it goes, then it would go to the planning board as the parent that would then, you know, be the sponsor of it as the changes as ordinances. And then it could be, yeah, it could be a joint, you've all done that before, right, with planning board and ordinance and.
Yep.
As
Sometimes with
sponsoring
success.
them, or?
No, as a joint public hearing.
Joint public,
Yeah.
most of the time.
It's depending on how
Yeah,
perfected
yeah,
it is.
yeah.
Most of the time.
But I'm thinking more of a public input at what level, workshop informal with the zoning revision committee, and then the legally required public hearing would be after it got to planning board, and then it would go to council from there. So there'd be the workshop, and then the more formal, and then the council part of it, so there'd be like 3 steps to it.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
one of them formal as a real public hearing, and one of them more workshoppy, with
Right,
more give and
right.
take.
And I would think you'd want more than one
Oh, yeah.
shopping thing, you should have as many as you need until you get some degree of.
Which
closure on it.
I'm assuming the zoning
Joe,
revision
how is,
committee.
is my impression from the letter that you wrote that you were advocating for the technical input up front, then followed by some public discussion of what comes out of that process, and then you go on from there to actually put through the changes that are being suggested,
Well, let me,
recommended.
I wanna make sure Jim gets a chance to say what he wants to say, but, I think it's important to have technical expertise on the committee.
Mhm.
I think from the standpoint of process, it's important, before you start getting really technical, I think it's important to I think you have the open it up first. Frankly, I think you need the technical expertise on the committee to explain to the public what some of the issues are, and how to frame it, and what the alternatives are, and,
So their role would be
and-
education then?
Pardon?
Their role would be education of the public,
you mean
or
the
interface
committee?
with the public or the community.
Well,
somehow.
I think, ideally, I think the committee has at least 2 functions. One is they are the public, they help with the public outreach. And so they help to coordinate that, and I think they help overcome whatever skepticism may conceivably exist in the public about city officials, because they're not all city officials. And also, they also function as technical advisors to the decision makers, who are ultimately the planning board and city council. So, yeah, but I still think that, you know, and I know Jim is, I saw his letter, I mean, public input is really important, and I think, that's why I think it needs to come early. I think whenever a detailed proposal gets hatched in what is perceived to be behind closed doors, and then it goes public, people immediately become suspicious, and I don't blame them. If there's no technical proposal on the table, there's just, you know, perhaps an exposition of, here are some of the ideas that we're thinking about. You know, and maybe with some slides and some visual presentation, then people have something. You can't just give them a totally blank slate and have a meeting and say, okay, tell us what you think about zoning, because, you know, you're not, what you get isn't gonna be useful. But you also don't wanna have, you know, a 25 or 200-page document that's full of legalese either. You wanna have some kind of intermediate document that's very readable and very understandable, and that lays out some of the choices. I would think, I mean, that's just, that's ultimately the decision that the committee would make.
What Joel is saying, what I hear is in essence consistent with the discussions around the best practices committee, and we've had a couple of hearings and have taken input from people, and we're hearing that the beginning of a decision-making process should be open-ended.
Yeah,
We should
exactly,
be
that's what I'm saying.
hearing a wide range of ideas, and then from that kind of distill them down, and then make a proposal that people can respond to. And if you were to model that, where it's, you know, wide in the end, and then you narrow down and widen up and then narrow it down, that's probably directly opposite from what most people have experienced in the city, where we come in with a narrow proposal. The proposal has already been made by somebody, and then it's go through a narrow process where there's tweaking done during public hearings. And what Joel's saying is I think significantly different, and I think something that people have will respond very positively to. But I agree, it has to be structured in such a way where they're given some meaningful information to respond to that's accessible and understandable. And then, we get the input, and then there's a proposal that's made, and then there's another public process. And then I would say it goes through the official process that David mapped up. But once it gets into that official process and we have these official hearings tend to be very formula. It comes in with a proponent, and then there's opponents, and we generally give them a set time limit, and there's not a lot of give and take. And most people find that very frustrating, especially if they haven't been in on the beginning part of it.
Yeah, what I found is that the more you do up front, the more you work it out, so when it gets to that formal part, people don't get frustrated because basically they've run out of things to say, because they've either already said it 5 times already, and either it was heard, or, either it was followed or it wasn't, but they realize, they've had their say. And it becomes kind of going through the motions, but people are okay with that because they know they have had their say.
So let's move to Jim for a little bit. Maybe he'll kind of spin it around for us a little bit for his flavor, his Ward 3 flavor.
Okay. All right, so, homework? All right, guys. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, so thanks to Owen Freeman Daniels, who I'm trying to convince to go to law school, who is a member of the Ward 3 Neighborhood Association. What he did was, and we worked on this together, basically, what we tried to do was look at Sustainable Northampton and really outline what are the tasks that it's asking this rezoning committee to do. And then there's gray area as to what it's supposed to do, and I think that is what you guys need to decide. That's where the judgment call comes in. So what we did was we broke it down into, let's see. But first of all, what's really clear in Sustainable Northampton are these first 2 things under the outline of discussion. The task of the rezoning committee, I mean, if you do a search on it, the rezoning committee comes up and it lays out, I believe it's basically 5 different tasks that it's supposed to work on. Owen and I, when we talked about it, we actually identified a 6th task, which is actually the most important one, because it all gets back to that map, interpreting the map. That every activity that you undertake, that this committee is supposed to undertake, goes back to that map, interpreting it, how does it relate to the plan, and how do you move forward. So if you look under the tasks here, we've laid out 6 tasks that the rezoning committee is going to be looking at. So I think that'll be helpful for you to figure out who can address those things. The second thing we looked at had to do with the, and this comes from the plan again, is that the rezoning committee, it doesn't act on its own on anything. It's always in relationship to either city council or the planning board, or there's probably about 8 other committees that it's dealing with. And therefore, that the people who are on the rezoning committee, it needs to be used to working on a committee. And also that within that the planning board matches up on task, I think it's on everything. And that city council matches up on, I think, 4 of the things. So it makes sense that least a member of city council and at least a member of the planning board be part of the rezoning committee. So those are the parts that are straightforward. But I think it'll be helpful in terms of, you know, all right, it's answering, so it starts to fill out how you put this committee together. The last part has to do with the composition of the rezoning committee. And we think that the plan lays out pretty clearly, you know, the officials part, that a member of city council, a member of the planning board, and then also somebody from the economic development department who, working with the mayor, should also be part of the rezoning committee. So per this proposal, we're saying somewhere between 3 to 5 city officials, at minimum 3, should be part of the rezoning committee. Then we get into members of the public. And the plan makes a distinction between officials who are in some way working for the city, serving the city in some way, and community members. And community members gets kind of sticky because, you know, it goes to that thing that my brother-in-law Bill Dwight talks about, is once you're on the committee, you're part of the problem, you know. And that, so how do you maintain that separate identity? And so Owen and I tried to address that. One of the things we went back to was the idea of sustainability is based on those 3 legs of the stool. And we figured that a member representative of each one of those legs should be part of the rezoning committee. So that goes back, Joel, remember, there's the economy, there's the environment, and then there's social equity. And that the members from the community should have get a representative for each one of those groups. We actually, we're recommending a 4th member to be part of the community, and somebody representing the development community, developers and construction people, just for their expertise. That there's got to be somebody out there who has done sustainable development that everybody can kind of go, this is a good guy, he gets it, he understands it, and we think that having that kind of expertise would be really good. In terms of how to decide on how to pull these members in, we recommend that you guys reach out to community organizations and ask them to send a representative rather than having people apply. So, for example, in terms of economic development in the economy and local businesses, we've listed a few different organizations that would probably be good to talk to. People involved with the chamber, or the Rotary, or the BID. Those are the types of organizations you can go to and get leadership. And what's important about what we're talking about with these organizations is that the representatives they send are not dependent on their role with city government. That somebody who's on the board of the chamber is going to be on the board of the chamber whether they're part of this committee or not. We also recommend, as far as the environment, speaking to possibly Broadbrook or what's the other one?
Non-talk land trust?
That would be good. You can add that. And there's the Audubon, right?
Oh, yeah, Arcadia.
Arcadia. So, and as far as the social equity piece, we are going to make our bid for a neighborhood association to provide a representative. That we feel that that neighborhood associations the way they're growing, they're working with the city, but at the same time, that they're kind of standing on their own. And I think that the input you're gonna get from them is gonna be really helpful. How to discern that fourth person from the development community. Oh no, let's see, what did, actually didn't read that one. Let's see what Owen came up with. Well, identify companies that have the below listed aspects and ask them for a nominee. So maybe, reaching out to a number of developers who have had a history with the city and saying, can you pick a guy? Who do you think is gonna be good? So,
Or a woman.
huh?
Or a woman.
Or, yeah, I know, thank you.
For the record.
Thank you.
But that, and I think we talked a little about that last time, that it diversifies so there isn't an appointing authority. If it's a representative put forward by this body or that body, it takes away someone ever saying, gee, this has got the character of a committee appointed by the mayor or appointed by, it diversifies the membership a little bit.
Right. So, we're more pointed in what we're presenting today, in terms of how to put together this committee. And I love the stuff that you've been bringing up because it gets into the process as to what's the next step in terms of what they're going to be doing. And I agree with you that having credible connections with the community is going to be really important. I think that communication is huge here. So.
Can I make a quick response to what Jim suggested? I think there's sort of two ways to think about what the role of the of all the people on it, really, including the people who are on city boards. And that is, are they representing an interest, or are they concerned with the city's welfare as a whole and understand bring a particular perspective? I've seen groups get very fractious and adversarial when you have people who see themselves as, I'm representing this neighborhood, or I'm representing the construction industry, or I'm representing the hospital, or whatever if they're there representing an interest, instead of trying to do what's in the city's best interest, but coming with a perspective and an expertise, I think you're going to get you're going to get a more congenial, a better functioning working group. Not to say you shouldn't have people from any of these groups. I always worry when it's seen as where I'm representing a constituency, as opposed to we're here to do what's best for the city. I mean, in that respect, for example, a developer who doesn't develop in Northampton but lives here and knows development inside out might be a better choice than a developer who's trying to do a project in Northampton, and somewhere along the line, whatever they recommend is going to affect his project. So, and that, but I'm not saying you should rule out developers who are active in Northampton. They have knowledge of the city that probably others don't. But I think that's, I don't know if you agree with me or not on that, but I think there's a tendency to say, well, we want to represent, or even the three legs. I mean, I would hope everybody on the committee is fully committed to all three legs. I don't think we should have environmentalists who don't care about social equity, and or people who just want economic development and don't care what that does to the environment. So, and I think commitment to the sustainability plan's principles is key as part of that.
You can create an oath that these members
I was gonna say, in other communities, how do they go about making those judgments?
Well, I'll tell you, this is the only community I've seen that had a committee to form a committee. Only in Northampton.
I have a question
Sure.
relating to what Joel just said, which is, isn't it true that there will be certain wards or neighborhoods which will be more affected by density and infill than others. And therefore, it is extremely important to have input from those folks.
Well, I think it's important to have input from everybody.
I agree.
And some neighborhoods are gonna be affected by density and infill, other neighborhoods are gonna be affected by restrictions on land development. You know, so, I mean, you can make the case that, you know, everybody stands to gain and everybody stands to lose, depending on how it's perceived and how it's done. So, I think that because infill is clearly a controversial issue, and, you know, that people on the committee, you know, need to be sensitive to that issue, and probably wouldn't be a bad idea if at least one. I mean, it could be a member of the planning board who lives in one of those wards too. It doesn't necessarily have to be. So I'm not saying it should or shouldn't be. I'm just saying, of course, there has to be sensitivity to that. But you know, if you try to say, if you say, well, we're going to empower Ward 3 because they are under pressure by infill, well, people in Ward 1 may say, well, we're also pressured by infill, and people in Ward 4 and people in Ward 7 are saying, well, you're taking away our right to develop our land, and you know, so you know, it's. I think that the people have to be skillful at listening to everybody and balancing these interests and these concerns in the best interest of the city. So that's all. If it becomes a battle over who's getting better representation, which interests, you know, then I think if people can look at the names on that committee and say, you know, those people are all really have the interests of this community at heart. That's, you know, the sort of the gut feeling test.
Holy grail, Joel.
Well, there are plenty of people in this town who do.
Yeah.
And you know, you know, Michael, I guess you asked me, you know, well, how have other communities done it? I haven't had a committee to appoint a committee. I mean, it's usually been just an outreach from either the council or the if there is a planning staff, the planning staff makes a recommendation, and you know, they try to do a balanced group, because it's self-defeating to have a group that's not balanced. You know, if it's not balanced, then whoever feels that their interests have been excluded is going to come in and blow it up sooner or later.
I want to read a little piece I brought in, and I think, Ken, you probably have one, and wondering why it's here. This is something that was passed at the last city council meeting. It's for forming the Energy and Sustainability Commission. And this came through a public process. And I think what's relevant is on the second page, under membership begins on the bottom of the first page. And I'm looking at the letter G. And I'll do a quick reading of it. And it mentioned some members, other members, which obviously wouldn't be necessarily appropriate for this committee. But for G, it says 4 members of the public selected to supply, and then there's a colon, and it mentions 3 general areas. And one of them is professional expertise with energy issues, and then it mentions some examples of those. The next general area is expertise in business, financing, or economic development. And then the third general area is representative of broad-based community interests. And then it mentions some particular types of organizations. And then it goes on. But the way that it kind of addressed is it mentioned you know, the important qualities to have in the committee as a general that has to be reflected in these 4 people. So I thought that was a way of going for balance. This is what we're looking for. We're looking for expertise, we're looking for representation of community interests, and it needs to be reflected in the appointments. So since that was something we just passed, rather than reinventing the wheel completely, I brought it in as an example of a possible way to go with looking at it. In my experience, most people don't just have one sliver that describes them, you know, just an expert and not concerned with anything else. Most people come in with a variety of concerns and interests, and so I think it's really important to kind of look at what everybody brings and make sure there's some balance in there. I think that's a key word.
Yeah, well, also, I think.
And trust.
I think you want to look for people who have credibility and trust, and who bring multiple things to the table, you know. They happen to be an engineer, they happen to be a planner professionally, they happen to be a naturalist, so they understand the environment, they happen to own a store downtown, or, whatever it is that, like, I think everybody around here wears a lot more than one hat, and so, more than one of those hats can fit, and people who wear multiple hats often have more to offer to a committee like that.
I agree with you, and I think we've talked about that a little bit, having this breadth of experiences and, work experience and values on the committee. And that speaks more, I think, to the application process or even the appointment process than it does to the proposal that's just, would your group recommend someone? Because then your group may be working out of a vacuum, not knowing who else is on the committee. It almost sounds like some group needs to look across the committee and say, okay, we want somebody with legal zoning experience, we want somebody who's written zoning laws, that kind of mixture, somebody with construction background, or else if people are just recommended by all these different groups, we may end up kind of tilted one way. But that's just how I'm thinking about it. It doesn't work. It's never going to work out that cleanly. There's always going to be a little strong in one area, I think, and weak in some other part of the experience.
He makes the appointment to city council.
We are going to have to make a recommendation. Who
No,
makes a
but I mean, are you going to recommend names, or are you going to recommend this type of person and that type of person?
When you say you, meaning this group here?
This
No.
group, yeah.
No, we're going to,
That's what I'm saying. Who's going to pick the names?
well, traditionally, like for example here, there's some of them are from the city council, and some of them are from the mayor's appointments. There's a representative from Smith Voc School by the superintendent in this one. So in most committees in the city, it is a kind of a mixed bag.
Because that does create the problem of George talked about, is that if one group is appointing a group of people and another group is appointing people, and the two groups don't know who the other ones are appointing, whereas if one group, I mean, in my experience, it's usually been one entity that picks everybody, but they pick that and picks everybody with a view toward balance, because then you know how to balance it, because you got this person and you got this person, and they balance each other out.
A recently formed committee that probably has more appointments sources than any other committee in the city is the Community Preservation Committee. And maybe it's because it has money, but it is probably the most successful committee. I mean, it is working very, very well. Yeah. There's mayoral appointments, there's council appointments, and then there's 4 or 5 appointments from separate bodies. But it was very clear.
Yeah,
and then there are 2 elected members on top of that, so it's really coming from a variety of sources.
But there was an application process that started
Yes.
there, wasn't there?
Yeah. And there's a very clear vision to the community preservation they're not like grasping for. So they went in there and it was very focused, but the people behind it were all very motivated and committed. But it's been a very successful committee so far.
To go back to something you'd mentioned earlier, and we sort of talked around it for a while. But did you talk about initially, because this group is going to have some, by its composition, some technical expertise, that they should use what is a public document, the sustainability plan, that's a public document that was assembled from public input, and then come up with talking points from that to start to focus public discussion. I don't mean they should sit down and write their recommendations and then simply vet them, but to be able to be a conduit to the public and to be able to collect public thought and turn it back into a technical document. That they should, did you suggest
Well,
they have some talking points to start the public going?
Well, again, you know, it's hard for me not to say, well, this is how I would, because I've done it so many times, but when you.
But we trust you, Joel, that's why we asked you here.
Yeah, I mean, but when you have an adopted plan, that's your jumping off point, you know, and then, but what you sometimes find is that there's certain things in it that work better than other things in it, but it's always good to tie back whatever is being recommended to it, and to use it as a starting point, say, well, we have, you know, there's these different things that the plan wants to see happen, and here are some of the ways to accomplish it. And I think one of the things that concerned me about the word rezoning committee was that if it looks like it's really a mapping exercise, then I think it's potentially gonna go down the wrong path. I mean, the map is important, but the map, if you see a map, and if you see the map and the map looks like a zoning map, and then it looks like this translates directly into the zoning categories in the current Northampton zoning code, then you're missing a big step, which is that you're going to be rewriting the Northampton zoning code. So, you know, what's colored orange on the map might mean something under today's zoning code, but if you're rewriting the zoning code, then that same district or something similar to it might actually mean something else. And that's a big part of the discussion, you know. For example, if we're going from more single-use type zoning to more mixed-use type zoning, then it's not just a matter of what's the map, although it's important, but it's a matter of, well, what does it mean to be in this district or that district? And are you even going to have the same zoning districts, or are you going to come up with a different configuration of zoning districts? I mean, those are the kind of things that seems to me have to at least be on the table. You may decide you're not going to change the map very much, but at least, you know, that's all somewhat up for grabs.
We don't have a chairperson of this committee, we're very informal. But I'm curious if there's anybody in the public who took out the time to come here and listen to this discussion, any more input or questions or concerns that you have?
I'm just gonna, I mean, I know that there's a lot of discussion about what's really best for the city, but again, that's a matter of perception as well. I mean, it's not what you think is best for the city as opposed to what I think is best to the city. It really is, that is something that needs to be discussed, and the public needs to be able to have input into, because what you think is best might not be what I think is best.
Yeah.
What, and
Would you like to?
I would, a couple of things. One is I think it's important to have everybody that joins it. I agree with Marie that, you know, everybody's gonna have a different idea of what is best for the city, but to make it clear that people should be coming into this with a view of trying to do what's best for the city, not so much representing a group, a constituency. That there will always be some of that, but really the purpose of us being here is to try to get the best thing, and just to say that, say, because if you don't say that, people are going to assume they're there for their constituency. The one other thing I wanted to say is that, you know, I think the idea of having people sent is going to have a better public acceptance, that people are going to see it less as yet another mayor's committee. And also, I'm a little concerned about 1 and 4, and that maybe there could be some language saying that whoever comes from 1 probably shouldn't be a developer.
Right,
if possible.
and per what we're talking about somebody there who's interested, you know, in developing industry and jobs in Northampton.
Right.
And, you know, not construction trade. you know,
Right.
that it be
Just,
outside.
just to widen the number of viewpoints.
Right.
Yep,
Thank you.
thanks.
I think another thing that's important to recognize is that there's a lot of work involved in this kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, one of the things that you always
It's an
see.
understatement.
Are you gonna volunteer, Joel?
I'm not necessarily, I know better than you do probably how much work it is.
Yeah.
And, what happens on committees, one or two people end up doing most of the work.
So there's
And
gonna have to be a
so-
staff person from the city, I would think, to do a brunt of the work.
But I think you also have to have people who are not just there to represent some viewpoint, but who are actually willing to, tangle with it and spend the time and I mean, people have to realize this, this is not easy work.
And it's not sexy work either.
No.
It's somewhat boring, much as I appreciate your profession, it's kind of somewhat dry. Yeah, so
I
I'm,
sometimes wonder why I
we've
tangle
had
with it
that,
myself.
yeah, we've had that discussion earlier about some people who might be able to do it, might wanna do it, ex-members of the planning board who've gone on to other things, they have a background now in planning, some lawyers who have that background in it. Now, are those people gonna step forward and say, yeah, I'm gonna meet twice a month for the next 2 or 3 years to really work through this sustainability and zoning revision? I don't know. We're gonna have to see, I guess. It's obvious to Ken and I that the planning board doesn't have the time to do all of this rezoning thinking while we're also doing permitting, and neither does the city council, and that's why the real need for this committee comes from.
Just one other reason why I think it's important to have I don't mean to beat a dead horse on the expertise thing, but if you have only one or two people who have expertise, or if the only person who has expertise is your staff person, then basically whoever has the expertise is gonna run the show, because they're gonna be able to tell everybody what it means, and other people aren't gonna be able to independently assess it. I think ideally you have to have the equivalent of peer review of each other, unless you wanna go out and pay for it, which you probably don't wanna do. So, in other words, you have to have people there who can read the work that somebody else has done and really understand it and see where the problems are, and it doesn't have to necessarily be a law. I mean, like, one of the best people I once had on committee was an English teacher who just could really read closely. And could ask questions like, can you rewrite that in English, please? Or let me rewrite that in English.
How do we, the sustainability plan is our starting point, and it's sort of a plateau of work completed at this point. How do we safeguard that this committee doesn't want to be drawn back into reinventing getting to that point, which is going to be very tempting. Whenever it's a public process, it's like, oh great, we're going to start this whole thing over. We're at the plateau of the sustainability plan. We're looking how to implement the steps in the plan. The plan has been accepted, the steps have been accepted. We're starting from there and moving forward. How do we not get drawn back to starting from scratch all over again?
I feel your pain.
Because a lot of the public's desire is going to be, oh great, we're starting over.
Well, I think to some extent, you can state up and down, this has been adopted and it's a given, but the fact remains that to the extent that there's stuff in there that was never really accepted by the public, it's gonna be revisited whether you like it or not, And most of the time.
But Joe, I can't imagine that wouldn't be true of any plan that we come up with.
Well, yeah, exactly.
So you
And
have
in
to
fact,
start somewhere.
That's why I usually recommend that a plan and zoning code be done simultaneously. Because then, instead of having to go back to the plan, you're working them out and you end up with a product that has them both at once. And in fact, that's what, I believe you did that with the Meadows plan. that was one of the really, I thought, I mean, the Meadows plan, I think, is one of the best processes that.
It was a very narrowly focused.
It was narrowly
issue,
focused.
though.
It
Much
was.
simpler to
And
deal
it
with.
was, oh, absolutely. But I think one of its strengths was that at the same time the plan was issued, the proposed zoning changes were issued right with it. And so you didn't have to approve a plan and then go back and revisit the plan when you were.
But that was
reviewing
the
zoning.
second phase of.
Oh, was it?
Yes.
Well, maybe I
That was a long
didn't.
process.
The first
Okay,
phase was
okay.
not as pretty.
Anyway.